October 11th, 1529. The sun hasn't completely come up over Vienna yet, but the Ottoman cannons have already started shooting. On the eastern walls, a 70-year-old commander watches an army of 120,000 soldiers getting ready to kill him. For 2 weeks, Ottoman miners have been digging tunnels under the city. The walls are cracked. Whole sections have fallen down. And now, as smoke floats across the walls, the final attack begins. He commands 16,000 defenders. 16,000 soldiers, Germans, Spaniards, Austrians, Bohemians, standing between Suleiman the Magnificent and the heart of Europe. If Vienna falls today, there's nothing between the Ottoman Empire and the Rhine. No help army is coming. No miracle is expected. Just mud, math, and the question every man on that wall is asking himself. Can we hold? Before we go back to that October morning, if you find value in this story, a like and comment would mean everything. It helps us reach more people who love history told the way it deserves to be told. Now, let's go back to the moment when 16,000 people prepared to face the impossible. But to understand why those 16,000 men were about to die, you have to go back 3 years to a muddy field in southern Hungary, to the day an entire kingdom disappeared. August 29th, 1526. Mohacs. King Louis II of Hungary was 20 years old when he led his army against Suleiman the Magnificent. He had 25,000 men. Suleiman had brought 60,000. The Hungarian nobles told Louis to wait. Help was coming from Transylvania. More troops from Croatia. If he could just hold for a few more days. But Louis was young and proud, and he believed God would help the righteous. He ordered the attack. The battle lasted less than 2 hours. Ottoman cannons tore through the Hungarian cavalry before they reached the Janissaries. The elite infantry, slave soldiers trained from childhood, moved in organized lines. Their guns cut down knights in armor who still believed wars were won with swords and lances. The Hungarian lines fell apart. 15,000 Christians died on that field. Bishops, nobles, the best commanders Hungary had. And Louis himself, running from the massacre, fell from his horse into a swollen stream. His fancy armor, the symbol of his kingship, filled with water and dragged him under. They found his body 3 weeks later, face down in the mud. Hungary's king drowned running away from the future. With him died Hungarian independence. Louis had no children, no brothers, no clear heir. Within weeks, 2 men stepped forward to claim the throne. The first was John Zapolya, voivode of Transylvania. He was Hungarian nobility, popular with the eastern lords, and he moved fast. In November of 1526, a Hungarian diet at Székesfehérvár elected him king. He had the crown. He had support on the ground, but he didn't have legitimacy. The second claimant was Ferdinand I of Habsburg, Archduke of Austria. He was married to Louis's sister Anna. His brother Charles V was the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful Christian ruler in Europe, controlling Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and territories in the New World. Ferdinand had bloodline. He had international recognition. He had money and armies. But he didn't have Hungary. By early 1527, the kingdom had split. Zapolya controlled the east. Ferdinand's forces occupied the west. 2 kings, 2 coronations, 1 dying kingdom being pulled apart. And in Constantinople, Suleiman watched. The Sultan had not come to Mohacs to put a Habsburg on Hungary's throne. Ferdinand's claim was a problem. If the Habsburgs controlled Hungary, they controlled the gateway to Ottoman Europe. Suleiman's empire would be blocked. His expansion stopped at the Danube. Unacceptable. In January of 1528, John Zapolya sent messengers to Constantinople with an offer. Recognize me as king and Hungary will be your ally. Suleiman agreed. The Treaty of Istanbul was signed. Zapolya would rule Hungary as an Ottoman vassal. In exchange, Suleiman would protect him from Ferdinand. It was a deal born of desperation, and it worked. Ottoman troops marched into Hungary, and Ferdinand's forces retreated. By mid-1528, Zapolya sat on the throne in Buda, secure under the Sultan's protection. But Ferdinand didn't stop. He continued to claim the crown, continued to occupy Western Hungary, continued to call himself King of Hungary in treaties and letters. For Suleiman, this was more than political theater. It was a direct insult. He had recognized Zapolya. He had invested his reputation, his authority, his word. And Ferdinand, this Habsburg prince, was acting as if the Sultan's decision meant nothing, as if Ottoman power stopped at the edge of its armies. Suleiman the Magnificent did not tolerate disrespect. May 10, 1529. The Sultan left Constantinople at the head of the largest army he had ever put together. Sources from that time claim 120,000 fighting men. Some say 300,000 more when you count the camp followers, engineers, laborers, and supply trains. Modern historians settle on a more conservative estimate, somewhere between 80,000 and 120,000 soldiers. Even at the lower number, it was a force unlike anything Europe had seen in generations. Among them marched the Janissaries, the elite slave infantry, boys taken from Christian families, converted to Islam, and trained into the most disciplined soldiers in the world. They had never failed to take a fort when ordered to attack it. There were the Sipahi, feudal cavalry given land in exchange for military service, armored horsemen who had crushed armies from Persia to the Mediterranean. There were Anatolian auxiliaries, Balkan irregulars, miners and sappers whose skills had cracked fortresses from Cairo to the Caucasus. And there was artillery, hundreds of guns, including the massive siege cannons, the bronze basilisks that had turned the walls of Rhodes and Belgrade to rubble. The plan was elegant. March through the Balkans, reinstall Zapolya in Buda, then continue northwest to Vienna, Ferdinand's capital. Occupy it, or burn it, or force Ferdinand to surrender. Break the Habsburgs, secure Hungary, extend the Ottoman Empire to the Rhine. Suleiman had never lost a campaign. He had no reason to believe this would be different. But the spring of 1529 was wet, unusually, disastrously wet. By the time the Ottoman army crossed into Hungary in late June, the roads had dissolved. Wagons sank axle-deep in mud. Horses struggled. And the heavy siege guns, those massive bronze monsters that could shatter stone walls, became impossible to move. Every day lost to mud was a day subtracted from the campaign season. By October, the rains would turn to snow. Armies didn't fight in winter. They couldn't. Suleiman's officers faced a choice: wait for the roads to dry and lose weeks, or abandon the heavy artillery and move fast with lighter guns. They chose speed. The great cannons were left behind. It was the first mistake, and it would cost them Vienna. September 10, 1529. The Ottoman vanguard reached Buda. Suleiman formally reinstalled John Zapolya as King of Hungary in a public ceremony. Zapolya knelt. He received his crown from the Sultan's hand. Everyone understood what it meant. Hungary was no longer independent. It was a gift, a possession. Zapolya ruled because Suleiman allowed it. But there was no time for celebration. Ferdinand's capital lay 150 miles to the northwest, and the calendar was burning. The army turned toward Vienna. By late September, the first Ottoman scouts appeared on the hills east of the city. Inside the walls, 16,000 men prepared to fight the most powerful empire on earth. Most of them knew they were going to die. The question was whether they could hold long enough to matter. The defenders of Vienna had every reason to be terrified because the man marching toward them had never been defeated. Not once. Suleiman I became Sultan in 1520 at the age of 26. Within a year, he conquered Belgrade, the fortress that had held back the Ottomans for 70 years. It fell in 3 weeks. In 1522, he turned his attention to Rhodes, the island stronghold of the Knights Hospitaller. The Knights were the best military order in Christendom, veteran crusaders who had defended Rhodes for over 2 centuries. Suleiman besieged them for 6 months. He lost an estimated 50,000 men taking that island, but he took it. The Knights surrendered on December 22, 1522. Suleiman allowed them to leave with their lives, a gesture of respect that shocked Europe. But the message was clear. No fortress, no matter how legendary, could stand against him. Then came Mohacs in 1526, the destruction of Hungary. A 2-hour massacre that erased a kingdom. By 1529, Suleiman controlled 3 continents. His empire stretched from the gates of Persia to the coast of Algeria. His navy ruled the Mediterranean. His armies had crushed every opponent they faced. He was called Suleiman the Magnificent in Europe. In the Ottoman court, he was Suleiman the Lawgiver, a ruler who reformed the legal system, supported the arts, and presided over what many considered the golden age of the empire. And he was only 35 years old. At his side was Ibrahim Pasha, his grand vizier and closest friend. The two had grown up together. Ibrahim was Greek by birth, taken as a slave, converted and raised to the highest office in the empire by Suleiman's personal favor. He was brilliant, ruthless, and completely loyal. Together, they had never lost. So why Vienna? Because Vienna wasn't just another city. It was the capital of Ferdinand I, Archduke of Austria, brother of the Holy Roman Emperor. Taking Vienna meant embarrassing the Habsburgs on their home ground. It meant proving that even the most powerful Christian dynasty in Europe couldn't stop the Sultan. But more than that, Vienna was a gateway. If Suleiman held Vienna, he controlled the Danube corridor. He could threaten Bohemia, Bavaria, and the German principalities. He could force the Holy Roman Empire to negotiate from a position of weakness. And if he destroyed Vienna, the psychological blow would shatter Christian morale across Europe. It would prove that no city, no matter how far from Constantinople, was beyond Ottoman reach. This wasn't just about Ferdinand's stubbornness over Hungary. This was about proving that the future belonged to the Ottomans. September 23, 1529. The army moved northwest from Buda in 2 massive columns. The vanguard, light cavalry and scouts, ranged ahead, sweeping through villages, taking prisoners, gathering information. Behind them came the main body. Infantry, heavy cavalry, artillery trains, supply wagons stretching for miles. The countryside emptied before them. Peasants abandoned their farms and ran west, carrying whatever they could. Those who stayed were killed or enslaved. Entire villages burned. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was strategy. An army of 100,000 men uses enormous resources. Foraging kept them fed. Terror kept the population from organizing resistance. And every refugee who ran to Vienna was another mouth the defenders had to feed. By September 27, the Ottoman vanguard reached the hills east of Vienna. And there it was. From the high ground, the city spread out below them like a stone fist. Medieval walls circled the core, studded with towers and gates. The Danube curved around the northern edge, a natural moat protecting one side. To the south and east, open ground, fields and orchards that had been stripped bare. The Viennese had burned their own suburbs to deny the Ottomans cover. Smart, but not enough. Ottoman officers surveyed the defenses with professional eyes. The walls were thick, but old. The towers were strong, but not designed to withstand modern artillery. There were no advanced bastions, no angled fortifications of the kind Italian engineers were building. This was a medieval fortress trying to survive in the age of gunpowder. It should have been easy. September 29, the Ottoman army completed its encirclement. Tents spread across the landscape, thousands of them, organized in precise military rows. Suleiman's command pavilion went up near the center. Massive, draped in silk, topped with the Sultan's personal flag. It was psychological warfare. The Sultan wanted the defenders to see the size of what they faced, to understand that resistance was pointless. From the walls, the Viennese watched the Ottoman camp grow and grow and grow. Campfires at night stretched to the horizon. Inside Vienna, men did the math. Even if the Ottomans lost 10 men for every defender, they would still win. The numbers were impossible. On the 3rd day of encirclement, an Ottoman group approached the walls under a white flag. They carried a message from the Sultan. Surrender. Open the gates. The garrison would be allowed to leave with their lives. the civilians would be spared. Vienna would become part of the Ottoman Empire peacefully. Refuse, and when the city fell, and it would fall, no mercy would be shown. The group waited at the base of the walls. From the ramparts, an old man looked down at them. His name was Niklas, Count of Salm, a veteran of wars in Italy and the Netherlands. He had fought at Pavia, one of the bloodiest battles of the century. Ferdinand, I had left him in command when he fled to Bohemia. Salm eyed the Ottoman messengers. Then he turned to his officers. Send them back. No negotiation, no debate. Vienna would not surrender. The Ottoman group returned to Suleiman's tent and delivered the answer. The Sultan showed no reaction. He had expected this. He gave the order. Begin the siege. But Suleiman and his commanders had already realized something troubling. They had no heavy siege guns. The great bronze cannons, the basilisks that had shattered Belgrade and Rhodes, were stuck 200 miles away in the Hungarian mud. What they had were lighter field guns, effective against infantry and cavalry, far less effective against stone walls. They could bombard Vienna for weeks and barely scratch the fortifications, which left one option: mining. Ottoman sappers were the best in the world. If they couldn't break the walls from above, they would collapse them from below. Dig tunnels beneath the foundations, pack them with gunpowder, detonate. It was slower than artillery, more labor-intensive. But it worked, and the Ottomans had done it 100 times before. On October 1st, the digging began. Under the cover of darkness, Ottoman engineers marked positions outside the walls. Then the sappers went to work, tunneling into the earth, burrowing toward Vienna's foundations like insects eating through wood. Inside the city, the defenders listened. They pressed their ears to the ground. They placed drums on the stone floors to amplify vibrations. They dug their own tunnels, countermines, trying to intercept the Ottomans before the explosives were set. The siege had begun, but it wasn't happening on the walls. It was happening beneath them, in the dark, in the mud, in tunnels so narrow a man couldn't stand. And when the first mine exploded, the real war would begin. While Ottoman sappers dug beneath the walls, the men inside faced a simpler problem. They were outnumbered 7-1, and their king wasn't coming. Ferdinand, I should have been in Vienna. He was Archduke of Austria. The city was his capital. The Ottomans were coming to destroy him personally. But Ferdinand was in Bohemia, 200 miles north, trying to scrape together reinforcements that didn't exist. He had sent letters to every Christian power in Europe, begging for help. To his brother, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who controlled Spain, the Netherlands, and half of Italy. Charles sent his regrets. He was fighting the French in Italy and couldn't spare a single soldier. To the German princes of the Holy Roman Empire, they sent polite refusals. Many were Protestant. They hated the Catholic Habsburgs more than they feared the Ottomans. To the Pope, to the Italian states, to Poland, prayers and sympathy. No troops. Vienna was alone. So Ferdinand did what kings do when they can't win. He ran. He left the defense to a 70-year-old man and whatever soldiers could be pulled together on short notice. If Vienna fell, Ferdinand would retreat deeper into Austria, maybe Bohemia, and negotiate from there. If Vienna held, he'd take the credit. Either way, he wouldn't be standing on the walls when the Janissaries came. The man he left in charge, Niklas, Count of Salm, knew what this was, a suicide mission dressed up as a defense. But Salm had spent 50 years at war. He'd fought in Italy during the wars of the League of Cambrai. He had commanded infantry at Pavia in 1525, one of the bloodiest battles of the century, where French knights were slaughtered by Spanish arquebusiers. He understood modern warfare. He understood gunpowder. And he understood that fortifications didn't hold because of stone. They held because of the men willing to die on them. Salm had roughly 16,000 soldiers under his command, maybe as many as 20,000 if you counted every militia member and armed civilian. Either way, it wasn't enough. But it was what he had. The garrison was a patchwork. About 1,000 Spanish infantry, professionals, many of them veterans of Italy. They brought tercio tactics, tight formations of pikemen supported by arquebusiers, disciplined, deadly at close range. Around 700 German Landsknechts, mercenaries famous for their two-handed swords and willingness to fight to the last man if the pay was good. Ferdinand had promised them a bonus if Vienna held. They intended to collect 1,500 Bohemian soldiers sent by Ferdinand's supporters in Prague, mixture of infantry and crossbowmen. The rest, perhaps 12,000 men, were Austrian, local militia, townsmen. Some had military training. Most didn't. They were shopkeepers, laborers, craftsmen who'd been handed pikes and told to defend their homes. And then there were the noblemen, Austrian lords who'd brought their personal troops into the city. Men like Wilhelm von Roggendorf, one of Ferdinand's senior commanders, who would later play a major role in Habsburg-Ottoman conflicts. It was a mixed force. They spoke different languages, followed different commanders, had different levels of training. But they shared one thing. They were trapped inside a city about to be besieged by the most powerful army in the world. Salm set about turning Vienna into a fortress. In late August, when it became clear Suleiman was marching west, the decision was made: burn the suburbs. Everything outside the city walls, homes, churches, workshops, stables, was put to the torch. If the Ottomans wanted wood for siege towers or cover for their troops, they'd have to bring it themselves. Civilians cried as they watched their neighborhoods burn, but Salm didn't give them a choice. Sentiment loses sieges. Pragmatism wins them. The walls themselves were medieval, thick stone, studded with towers and gates, but they weren't designed for gunpowder warfare. Cannons could crack stone. Mines could collapse foundations. So Salm's engineers reinforced them. They piled earth embankments behind the walls to absorb artillery impacts. Stone shatters. Earth absorbs. They dug ditches in front of the walls, deeper, wider, harder to cross. They built killing zones behind the gates. If the Ottomans breached a gate, they'd funnel into a courtyard swept by crossfire from 3 directions. And they dug counter-mining tunnels. Salm knew the Ottomans would go underground, so his engineers dug a network of defensive tunnels beneath the walls, listening posts where men could detect enemy digging and intercept it before the explosives were planted. This was siege warfare in 1529. Not romantic, not glorious, just math, dirt, and preparation. Then there was the civilian problem. Vienna's normal population was around 20,000 people. But when Suleiman's advanced forces started burning villages in eastern Austria, refugees poured into the city by the thousands. By late September, there were perhaps 40,000 mouths to feed inside the walls. Every refugee was another drain on food supplies, another body taking up space, another person who might panic when the bombardment started. Salm organized them. Able-bodied men were put to work reinforcing defenses, hauling supplies, digging trenches. Women were assigned to medical stations, kitchens, ammunition production. Children ran messages between commanders. Anyone who couldn't or wouldn't work was given a simple choice: leave the city now or stay and follow orders. Most stayed because outside the walls, the Ottomans were taking prisoners, thousands of them. And the stories the refugees told were specific. Entire villages enslaved. Men executed. Women and children marched east in chains to be sold in Constantinople's slave markets. Surrender wasn't safety. It was a different kind of death. October 1st, the first night of mining. The garrison could hear it. Not the digging itself. That was too deep, too distant. But the vibrations, the subtle tremors that ran through the stone foundations when shovels bit into earth far below. Salm's engineers went into the counter-mining tunnels with listening devices, simple acoustic instruments, sometimes just cloth stretched over wooden frames like drums, placed against the tunnel walls to amplify sound. They listened in the dark, trying to pinpoint where the Ottoman sappers were digging. How deep? How close? When they found an enemy tunnel, they had 2 options. Option 1, dig an intercepting tunnel and break into the Ottoman mine before the explosives were set. Kill the sappers, collapse the tunnel. Option 2, set their own explosives and blow the enemy tunnel before it reached the wall. Both options meant fighting underground in spaces so tight you couldn't swing a sword, where a tunnel collapse could bury you alive. The men who volunteered for counter-mining duty were either very brave or very stupid. Most were both. By October 3rd, the Ottomans had at least a dozen tunnels advancing toward different sections of wall. The defenders intercepted 3 of them. In one, a counter-mining team broke through into an Ottoman tunnel and fought a 15-minute battle in total darkness. Knives, pickaxes, fists. When it was over, 11 Ottomans were dead, and the tunnel was collapsed. The defenders lost 6 men. Their bodies were never recovered, buried in the earth. No graves, no markers, just gone. Above ground, the Ottomans kept up steady artillery fire. Not enough to breach the walls, they didn't have the guns for that, but enough to keep the defenders from sleeping. Enough to fray nerves. Every few hours, a cannonball would slam into the fortifications. Stone would crack. Dust would billow. The defenders would rush to repair the damage, knowing that every weak point was a target for the next mine. It was exhausting. Not because of the fighting, there had barely been any real combat yet, but because of the waiting. Waiting for the next explosion, waiting for the next tunnel to reach the walls, waiting for the assault they all knew was coming. On the night of October 5th, Salm walked the walls. He did this every night, visiting each section, talking to the soldiers, letting them see that their commander wasn't hiding in a palace. He was standing with them. At the Corinthian gate on the southeastern side, he stopped. One of his engineers approached. "My lord, the vibrations are stronger here. They're close. Maybe a day away from detonation." Salm nodded. "How deep is our countermine?" 15 feet. "We haven't found their tunnel yet. Keep digging." The engineer hesitated. "If we don't find it in time, then we'll hold the breach," Salm said. He continued his walk. Behind him, far beneath the city, men were digging toward each other in the dark. One side trying to destroy the walls, the other trying to stop them. Both sides knowing that when they met, only one would walk out. October 6th, dawn. The first mine detonated. The explosion came at dawn. Not a sound first, a feeling. The ground lurched. Stone groaned. Then the noise hit. A deep, crushing roar that rattled teeth and collapsed lungs. At the Corinthian gate, a 40-foot section of wall dropped into the earth. The mine had been packed with gunpowder and detonated perfectly. The foundation collapsed, and the wall above it, 20 feet of medieval stone, came down in a cascade of dust and rubble. When the dust cleared, there was a breach, a gap in Vienna's defenses wide enough for 20 men to walk through side by side. From the Ottoman lines, war drums began to pound. Salm was on the walls within 2 minutes. He had been awake. He was always awake. And he reached the Corinthian gate before the dust had even settled. What he saw was worse than expected. The breach wasn't just a crack in the wall. It was a ramp. The rubble had spilled outward and downward, creating a slope. The Ottomans could charge straight up into the city. Behind him, soldiers were already moving into position. Spanish infantry forming ranks. Lanzknechts dragging pava shields, massive wooden barriers tall enough for a man to crouch behind. Arquebusiers checking their powder, loading shot. They'd prepared for this. They'd built secondary defenses behind every major gate, earthworks, barricades, overlapping fields of fire. But preparation and reality are different things. Salm turned to his second in command, Wilhelm von Roggendorf. "How long until they come?" Roggendorf looked toward the Ottoman camp. Flags were moving. Infantry formations assembling. "Minutes. Then we hold here," Salm said. "If they get through this breach, they'll be inside the city by noon." He raised his voice so the soldiers around him could hear. "They're going to hit us with everything. You hold this line or you die on it. Those are the only 2 options. No speeches, no appeals to God or glory. Just the truth." The assault began 10 minutes later. No warning, no horn blast, just the sound of thousands of boots on hard ground. The Janissaries came first. Elite infantry, white felt caps, curved swords, arquebus slung across their backs. They moved in formation, tight, disciplined, fast. Behind them, provincial troops, thousands of them. A human wave designed to overwhelm. The defenders opened fire at 100 yards. Arquebus cracked. Crossbows snapped. Small cannons loaded with grapeshot, metal fragments packed into cloth bags, turned into giant shotguns, tore into the advancing ranks. Men fell. Dozens of them. But the Janissaries didn't slow. They'd done this 100 times. They knew the defenders would get one, maybe two volleys before they reached the breach. After that, it was close combat. And close combat was where the Janissaries excelled. At 50 yards, the defenders fired their second volley. More Ottomans dropped, but there were always more behind them. At 20 yards, the Janissaries drew their swords and charged. They hit the breach like a hammer. The first line of defenders, Spanish infantry with pikes, braced and held. Pikes are simple weapons, long wooden shafts tipped with steel, nearly impossible to get past if the formation holds. And the Spanish held. The Janissaries slammed into the pike wall and stopped. Men impaled themselves trying to push through. Others tried to grab the shafts and pull them aside. That's when the arquebusiers fired. Point blank, 5 feet away. Lead balls punching through Ottoman armor and bone. The Janissaries reeled back, reformed, came again. This time they brought siege ladders, long wooden poles they jammed into the rubble to create makeshift bridges over the pipeline. Some carried bundles of wood to fill gaps. Others had small axes to chop at the pike shafts. It was brutal, methodical infantry work. No heroics, just professionals doing what they were trained to do. And they were pushing the defenders back. Salm saw it happening. The Spanish were holding, but they were taking casualties. Every minute, another pikeman went down. Another gap in the line. If the formation broke, the Janissaries would pour through. He turned to a captain of the German Landsknechts. Reinforce the center now. The Germans moved in. Big men in half-armor carrying Zweihanders, two-handed swords designed to cut through pike shafts and enemy formations alike. They waded into the fight with the kind of reckless aggression that makes Landsknechts either very effective or very dead. In this case, effective. The German swordsmen pushed into the breach and started swinging. Ottoman soldiers, packed tight in the narrow gap, couldn't maneuver, couldn't dodge. The Zweihanders cut through arms, legs, necks. Blood turned the rubble slick. For the first time since the assault began, the Janissaries hesitated. Not out of fear, but because the breach had become a killing zone. Every step forward cost lives. And even elite infantry have limits. An Ottoman officer, probably a Topkubasai, a Janissary company commander, shouted orders. The assault pulled back. Not a retreat, a repositioning. They were regrouping for another push. Salm didn't waste the time. Get the wounded out. Bring up fresh troops. Reinforce the barricades. Men scrambled. The injured were dragged to the rear. Reserves moved forward. The dead, both Christian and Ottoman, were left where they fell. No time for burials. Ammunition was brought up. Gunpowder, lead shot, crossbow bolts. A Spanish officer approached Salm, blood running down his face from a gash above his eye. We can't hold another push like that. We've lost a third of the pikemen. Then we hold with 2/3, Salm said. The officer stared at him, then nodded and went back to his men. The second assault came 20 minutes later. This time the Janissaries were supported by archers. Ottoman bowmen positioned themselves in the rubble just outside effective arquebus range and started shooting high, arcing volleys into the breach. Arrows fell like rain. It wasn't about accuracy. It was about forcing the defenders to raise their shields, to take cover, to stop shooting back. Under that cover, the Janissaries advanced again. And this time they brought grenades, primitive explosives, clay pots filled with gunpowder, fused and thrown. When they detonated, they sent shrapnel and concussive force in every direction. One landed in the middle of the Spanish pike formation. The explosion killed 4 men instantly and shattered the pikes of a dozen more. The line broke. Janissaries poured through the gap. For 30 seconds, it looked like Vienna was lost. Ottoman soldiers were inside the breach, past the pikes, into the city. But they ran into the second line of defense. The killing zone Salm had built behind the breach, a courtyard with no exit, surrounded by buildings on 3 sides. Every window held an arquebusier. Every rooftop had crossbowmen. The Janissaries walked into a crossfire. Shots came from above, from the sides, from behind. There was no cover, nowhere to run except back the way they'd come. They tried to push forward anyway, tried to find a way through. But the defenders had built barricades at every exit, sharpened stakes, overturned carts, anything to slow the advance. And while the Janissaries were trapped in the courtyard, the defenders shot at them with guns and arrows. It lasted maybe 2 minutes. When it was over, the courtyard was filled with dead bodies. The survivors ran back through the hole in the wall, pulling their injured friends with them. The second attack had failed. Noon. The Ottomans pulled back to their camp lines. Inside Vienna, the defenders counted how many they lost. Around 300 men were dead or too hurt to fight in 4 hours. The hole in the wall was still open. The wall was still broken down. And the Ottomans had tens of thousands of soldiers. This was just the beginning. Ordered everyone to start fixing the wall right away. Work crews went into the hole. Regular people, soldiers, anyone who could lift a rock. They carried broken pieces from destroyed buildings, dirt, wood, anything that could fill the gap. By nighttime, the hole had been partly fixed. Not rebuilt, but strong enough that it wasn't a wide open path anymore. Barriers were put up, sharp wooden stakes were hammered into the ground. The Spanish pike soldiers lined up again with fresh troops. It wasn't a wall, but it could be defended. That night, Sam walked through the broken wall himself. Soldiers sat in the rubble, completely tired. Some were eating, some were praying. Most just stared at nothing. He stopped next to a young Austrian soldier. A regular citizen soldier, maybe 19 years old, who was holding a blood-covered pike. "First time?" Sam asked. The kid nodded. "You did well." "I killed a man," the kid said quietly. "Face to face. I saw his eyes." Sam didn't try to comfort him. Didn't tell him it gets easier. "Good," he said. "That means you'll be ready when they come again tomorrow." He kept walking. Behind him, the kid held his pike tighter and went back to staring at the dark. Underground, the digging kept going. While the fighting happened above, Ottoman tunnel diggers were already digging tunnels toward other parts of the wall. The defender tunnel teams worked through the night, listening, digging, trying to find them. In one tunnel, a team broke through into an Ottoman tunnel. They fought with pickaxes and knives in a space 4 feet high and 3 feet wide. 6 defenders went in. 4 came back. The Ottoman tunnel was collapsed, but there were 11 more. October 7th, dawn. Another bomb exploded underground, this time at the Berg, the castle gate on the northwest corner. Another hole in the wall, another attack. Another day of holding the line by inches. The Ottomans came at them with everything. Janissaries, regular soldiers, grenades, fire arrows. And again the defenders held, barely. By nighttime on the 7th, the army inside had lost another 400 men. They'd started with 16,000. They were down to about 15,000 soldiers who could still fight, and the Ottomans hadn't even used their full army yet. This became the pattern of the battle. Every day, another underground bomb, another explosion, another hole in the wall. Every day, an attack. Every night, desperate repairs. The defenders learned to sleep in shifts, eat while standing, and fight with injuries that would have sent them to a hospital in peacetime. There was no help coming, no extra soldiers, no end in sight. Just the knowledge that if they broke, if the line collapsed for even an hour, the city would fall and everyone inside it would die. By October 10th, the army inside was down to 13,000 soldiers. 3,000 had been killed or hurt in less than a week. Suleiman could afford to lose men. He had 100,000 soldiers. Sam couldn't. But the walls still stood, and the defenders weren't done yet. By October 10th, Suleiman had a problem. He'd been outside Vienna for 2 weeks. He'd set off a dozen underground bombs. He'd sent wave after wave of Janissaries against the holes in the wall, and he'd gained nothing. The walls were cracked, parts had fallen down, but the city hadn't fallen. Worse, his army was falling apart. It started with the rain. The autumn rains that had slowed the march from Constantinople hadn't stopped. If anything, they'd gotten worse. Every night, water poured from the sky. The Ottoman camp, thousands of tents spread across open ground, turned into a swamp. Soldiers woke up with their feet in mud. Tents fell down. Firewood was soaked, making it nearly impossible to cook food or stay warm. Gunpowder had to be kept in sealed containers because wetness made it useless. And the cold was coming. October in Austria is not warm. Temperatures were dropping. Men who'd marched from Anatolia, used to warm weather, were shivering through the nights in wet clothes. Frostbite started appearing. Then sickness. Dysentery tore through the camp first, soldiers getting sick, losing fluids faster than they could replace them. Dehydration, weakness, death. Then typhus spread by lice in unwashed clothing and crowded conditions. Fever, rash, confusion. The Ottoman doctors did what they could, but there were no medicines in 1529. No understanding of germs, no understanding of why disease spread. Men just died. By early October, the army was losing hundreds of soldiers per day to illness. Not from Austrian weapons, from invisible killers they couldn't fight. Morale collapsed along with the health of the troops. The Janissaries, the best soldiers, had never failed to take a castle when ordered to attack it. Never. But they'd attacked Vienna's holes in the wall 5 times in 4 days and been pushed back every time. It wasn't that the defenders were better soldiers. They weren't. It was the defenses, the backup defenses, the killing zones behind every hole in the wall, the overlapping shooting positions. Every attack cost lives. And the Janissaries were starting to question whether this city was worth it. Complaining started in the ranks. Quiet at first. Why are we here? Why aren't we in winter camp? This isn't our war. This is the Sultan's pride. Ottoman officers tried to stop it. A few soldiers were killed as examples. But you can't kill fear by example, and you can't kill the weather. Then the supplies started running out. An army of 100,000 men ate huge amounts of food. Bread, meat, grain for the horses, water. The supply line stretched back to Buda, 150 miles southeast. From there, it ran all the way to Constantinople. But the same rain that was drowning the camp had turned the roads into rivers of mud. Wagons couldn't get through. Pack horses got stuck. Supplies that should have arrived daily were taking a week. Food rations were cut once, twice. By early October, soldiers were on half rations. Hungry men don't fight well. Hungry men run away. And desertions were climbing. Regular troops, irregular soldiers who weren't forced to serve like the Janissaries, started sneaking away at night, heading south, heading home. Ottoman officers couldn't stop it. The army was too spread out, the camp too messy. By October 10th, Suleiman had probably lost 10,000 men to disease, desertion, and fighting. He still had way more soldiers than Vienna. But numbers don't mean anything if your army stops working. October 10th, evening. Suleiman called his war council meeting in his command tent. Present were Ibrahim Pasha, the Grand Vizier and the top military commanders, the Beylerbey of Ramelia, the commander of the Janissaries, the head of the artillery, and the chief engineer. The question was simple. Do we continue the attack or do we leave? The chief engineer spoke first. We've set off 14 underground bombs. We've created 6 holes in the wall, but the defenders fix them every night. They've built backup defenses behind every gap. We'd need another month to knock down enough of the wall to make it impossible to defend. We don't have another month, Ibrahim Pasha said. He pointed toward the tent flap where rain was drumming against the fabric. It's October 10th. In 2 weeks, this rain will turn to snow. The roads are already impossible. If we wait much longer, we won't be able to leave even if we want to. The commander of the Janissaries spoke next. The men are exhausted. Disease is spreading. Morale is bad. We can't keep this attack going into winter. One of the commanders, who wanted to keep fighting, disagreed. If we leave now, we'll be admitting defeat. The Sultan has never failed to take a city he attacked. This will make the Habsburgs brave. It will make us look weak. Silence. Everyone knew he was right. This wasn't just about Vienna anymore. It was about reputation, about the Sultan's image, about whether the Ottoman Empire could be stopped. If Suleiman left without taking the city, every Christian power in Europe would see it as proof that the Ottomans weren't unbeatable. But if he stayed and the army fell apart, if disease and weather destroyed his forces, that would be an even worse disaster. Suleiman had been listening without speaking. Now he looked at Ibrahim Pasha. Your recommendation? Ibrahim hesitated. Then, one final attack. Full strength. Use everything. If we take the city, we spend winter there and march home in the spring. If we fail, he didn't finish the sentence. If we fail, we leave and live with the shame. Suleiman nodded slowly. How long to prepare? 1 day. Then we attack on the 11th. The order went out that night. Every available soldier, Janissaries, regular soldiers, cavalry getting off their horses to fight as foot soldiers, would attack Vienna at the same time. No holding back reserves, no limited test attacks. Everything all at once. Break the walls, overwhelm the defenders, take the city, or die trying. The attack would begin at dawn. Inside Vienna, the defenders didn't know the details, but they could feel it. The Ottoman camp was moving. Campfires burning brighter, war drums sounding late into the night, troops gathering in formation. Something was coming. Sam walked the walls one more time that night. He stopped at the Karntnertor, the hole in the wall that had been attacked and repaired 4 times already. The defenses were holding, barely. Rubble and wood and desperation. A Spanish officer approached. My lord, the men are asking. How much longer can we hold? Sam looked at him. 1 more day. And after that? We'll worry about that when it comes. The officer nodded and left. Sam stayed on the wall, staring out at the Ottoman camp. Thousands of fires, tens of thousands of soldiers. He'd done everything he could. Reinforced the defenses, organized the tunnel defense, rationed the supplies, kept morale from collapsing. But tomorrow, none of that might matter. If Suleiman threw his entire army at the walls, the defenders would be outnumbered 10-1 in every area. You can't hold those odds forever. Across the city, soldiers prepared. They sharpened weapons, checked armor, wrote letters they knew would never be sent. The regular people, women, children, old men, gathered in churches and prayed. Some prayed for victory. Most just prayed for it to be quick. October 11th, 4 a.m. The rain had stopped. For the first time in a week, the sky was clear, stars visible, a cold wind blowing from the north. On the walls, the defenders stood in silence. In the Ottoman camp, 100,000 soldiers prepared to attack. Suleiman himself put on his armor. Not ceremonial armor, battle armor. He planned to be close enough to see the city fall. At 5 a.m., the war drums began. At 5:30 a.m., the first light appeared on the eastern horizon. And at dawn, October 11th, 1529, the largest attack of the battle began. The Ottoman artillery opened fire at dawn. Not at specific targets, at everything. Every gun they had. Field cannons, big guns, whatever pieces hadn't been left behind in the Hungarian mud, fired at once. The shooting wasn't designed to break walls. It was designed to keep defenders' heads down while the attack columns moved forward. The noise was overwhelming. Continuous thunder, stone cracking, dust rising. And through the smoke and chaos, the Ottoman army came. Not at one hole in the wall, at all of them. This wasn't like the previous attacks, focused attacks on single weak points. This was total war. Janissaries hit the Karntnerter hole. Regular troops attacked the Berg. Cavalry fighting on foot attacked the parts of wall damaged by bombs near the Stubenter. All at the same time. Sam had 13,000 soldiers. He couldn't focus his forces anymore. He had to defend everywhere at once. He sent runners sprinting through the city with orders. Spanish soldiers to the Karntnerter. German soldiers to the Bergtor. Austrian regular soldiers to the Stubenter. Bohemian soldiers to reinforce wherever the line broke first, because it was going to break somewhere. The only question was whether they could contain it. Karntnerter, 6 a.m. The Janissaries hit the hole in the wall like a tidal wave. No testing, no checking the defenses, just a full-speed charge with ladders, grenades, and swords. The Spanish pike line held for 30 seconds. Then a Janissary grenade landed in the formation. The explosion killed 3 men and broke a dozen pikes. The line bent. Ottoman soldiers poured through the gap, swords out, screaming. They made it 10 feet into the city before running into the German swordsmen. The German soldiers met them with huge 6-foot blades designed to cut men in half. No skill, just raw violence. The fight became a meat grinder. Bodies piling up. Blood making the rubble slippery. Neither side could move forward. Neither side could run away. They just killed each other until one side ran out of men. Berg, 6:15 a.m. The second hole in the wall was wider. A bomb had collapsed 60 feet of wall 2 days earlier, and the defenders hadn't been able to fully fix it. The Ottomans knew it. They sent 2,000 regular troops straight at it. The Austrian regular soldiers holding that section weren't professional soldiers. They were shopkeepers and blacksmiths who'd been handed pikes 3 weeks ago. They broke. Not because they were cowards. They just weren't trained for this. When 2,000 screaming men charged at you, instinct says run. Half the soldiers ran away. The other half tried to hold and got overrun. Ottoman soldiers were inside the city. A runner reached Sam within a minute. Bergtor has fallen. Ottomans are through. Sam didn't hesitate. Send the Bohemians. Everything we have in reserve. Contain them. The Bohemian soldiers, 1,500 men, were the last reserve Sam had. If he used them and another hole opened, there'd be nothing left. But if he didn't use them, the Ottomans would be in the city center by noon. The Bohemians ran toward the Berg. Stubenter, 6:30 a.m. A third attack hit the eastern wall where a bomb had weakened but not collapsed the foundation. The Ottomans brought battering rams. Huge tree trunks carried by 20 men, swung repeatedly against the cracked stone. The defenders dropped rocks from above, poured boiling water, shot anyone who got close. It didn't matter. For every man who fell, another took his place. After 10 minutes of battering, the wall gave way. Not a full hole, just a crack. Wide enough for one man at a time to squeeze through. But one man was enough. Janissaries started pushing through the gap, one after another, forming a defensive position on the inside while more came through behind them. The defenders threw everything at them. Grenades, arrows, men with axes. The Janissaries held. Within 5 minutes, 50 Ottoman soldiers were inside Vienna. Within 10 minutes, 200. Sam was at the Karntnerter when the news reached him. 3 holes in the wall. Ottomans inside the city at 2 of them. He turned to Wilhelm von Rogendorf. I'll take command here. Hold this hole in the wall. Where are you going? Berg. If we lose the northern part of the city, we lose the city. Sam grabbed 20 men, his personal guards, and ran. He was 70 years old. He had been awake for 36 hours. He had a leg wound from a bomb explosion 3 days earlier. He ran anyway. Berg, 7 a.m. By the time Sam arrived, the Bohemians had engaged the Ottomans in the streets just inside the hole. It was house-to-house fighting. Ottomans smashing down doors, defenders shooting from windows, regular people trapped in basements, listening to men kill each other above them. The Bohemians were pushing the Ottomans back, barely. But more Ottomans kept pouring through the hole. Sam grabbed the Bohemian commander. "You have to close that hole. I don't care how. If they keep coming through, we're finished. We've tried. They're dug in. We can't get close without losing half our men." Sam looked at the hole. Ottoman soldiers were using the rubble as cover, shooting at anyone who approached. He needed to collapse the hole itself. Make it impossible to pass through. "Do we have explosives?" The commander nodded. "Some charges for tunnel work." "Bring them. We're going to blow the hole. That will kill our own men. Better than losing the city." The commander stared at him, then ran to get the charges. 10 minutes later, a team of engineers approached the hole carrying barrels of gunpowder. They were under constant fire. 2 men were hit before they reached the rubble. The others kept going. They placed the charges at the base of the collapsed wall, right where the Ottomans were using it as cover, and lit the fuses. 30-second fuse. The engineers ran. The Ottomans saw what was happening and tried to run too. The explosion went off before most of them made it. The blast collapsed what was left of the wall, burying dozens of Ottoman soldiers and sealing the hole under tons of stone. The Ottomans inside the city were cut off from help. The Bohemians turned on them. It took 20 minutes to kill or capture every Ottoman soldier who'd made it through. The Berg was retaken. Stubenter, 8 a.m. The crack in the eastern wall was still open and Janissaries were still pouring through. But the space was so narrow that only one man could fit at a time. That created a bottleneck. The defenders turned it into a killing zone. They couldn't stop the Janissaries from coming through, but they could kill each man as he came out. Crossbow soldiers positioned themselves 10 feet from the crack and shot anyone who stepped through. When a Janissary made it past, foot soldiers cut him down. It was slaughter, methodical, mechanical. The Janissaries kept coming anyway, because they were Janissaries. Because they had been trained since childhood to obey, because retreat wasn't in their training. By 9 a.m., there were over 300 dead Janissaries piled inside the wall, and they were still coming. Finally, an Ottoman officer on the other side of the wall gave the order to stop. The attack on the Stubenter ended. The crack remained, but no one was coming through anymore. Karntnerter, 9:30 a.m. The fighting at the main hole had been continuous for over 3 hours. The Spanish pike line had been reinforced twice. The German swordsmen had lost half their number. The rubble was piled with bodies, Christian and Ottoman mixed together, impossible to tell apart in death. And the Janissaries were still coming, wave after wave, relentless, professional, disciplined. But they weren't gaining ground. Every meter they moved forward cost a dozen lives. And the defenders kept rebuilding the barriers, kept reforming the lines, kept firing into the packed ranks. Then something unexpected happened. The women of Vienna entered the fight. They'd been carrying ammunition all morning, carrying water, dragging wounded men to the medical stations. But when the Spanish lines started to collapse for the 3rd time, when it became clear the soldiers were running out of strength, the women stepped onto the walls. Not with swords, they weren't soldiers, but with stones, with boiling oil, with anything they could throw. A group of women positioned themselves on the intact sections of wall overlooking the hole and started throwing rocks down onto the Janissaries below. Others heated oil in huge pots and poured it over the edge. The screams of burned men echoed across the battlefield. One woman, her name isn't recorded, picked up a fallen soldier's gun, loaded it, and shot an Ottoman officer in the chest. The historians noted it because it was extraordinary. But dozens of women did similar things that day. Not because of training, not because of duty, because of survival. Because if the walls fell, they knew what came next. Slavery, rape, death. So they fought. 10 a.m. The Ottoman attack began to lose momentum. Not because the soldiers stopped trying, but because the defenders had held every critical point. The Burgtor was sealed. The Stubenter crack was a death trap. The Karntnertor was still a meat grinder with no breakthrough. And the Ottomans were running out of soldiers willing to die for those extra few meters. Officers tried to rally their men for another push. Some units obeyed. Others hesitated. The Janissaries, bloodied and exhausted, pulled back to regroup. Regular troops stopped attacking entirely. By 11 a.m., the attack had stalled. Sam was back at the Karntnertor directing the defense when the explosion happened. A bomb, one the tunnel defense teams had missed, exploded directly beneath a watchtower 50 feet from where he stood. The tower collapsed. The shock wave threw men off the walls. Debris flew in every direction. A chunk of stone the size of a man's fist hit Sam's side. He went down. His guards rushed to him, thinking he was dead. He wasn't. But blood was soaking through his armor. The impact had cracked ribs, possibly punctured something internal. "Get me up," he said. "My lord, you need a doctor. Get me up." They pulled him to his feet. He swayed, steadied himself, and looked out at the battlefield. The Ottomans were regrouping for another attack. "How long until they come again?" "Minutes, my lord." Sam nodded, turned to his second in command. "If I fall, you take command. Hold this wall. That's all that matters." Then he walked, limped, back to his position on the wall. The soldiers saw him, wounded, bleeding, still standing. It steadied them. If a 70-year-old man with broken ribs could stand on that wall, they could, too. Noon. The Ottomans launched one final push. Not a coordinated attack, just desperate scattered attacks by units that still had the will to try. They were pushed back at every point. By 2 p.m., the attack stopped. By 4 p.m., the Ottoman army was pulling back to its camp lines. By nightfall, the battlefield was silent except for the screams of the wounded. The attack had lasted 12 hours. The Ottomans had used everything. Janissaries, regular troops, cavalry fighting as foot soldiers, grenades, bombs, artillery. And they had failed. Vienna still stood. The defenders counted their losses that night. About 800 dead, another 500 too hurt to fight. They were down to 11,700 soldiers who could still fight. But the walls held. And across the Ottoman camp, Suleiman faced a reality he had never faced before. He couldn't take this city. That night, October 11th, Suleiman the Magnificent sat in his command tent and faced something he'd never experienced. Defeat. Not on a battlefield. His army was still whole, still capable of fighting. But defeat nonetheless. The cost of the day's attack was huge. Ottoman officers delivered the casualty reports in silence. 2,400 dead, another 1,800 wounded, many of whom would die from infection within days. Over 4,000 soldiers lost in one day for nothing. The walls still stood. The defenders were still fighting. Vienna had not fallen. Ibrahim Pasha stood beside the Sultan, reading the reports. "The Janissaries are refusing orders," he said quietly. Suleiman looked up. "Refusing? Not openly. But their officers report the men won't attack the holes in the wall again. They're calling it suicide. The Janissaries, the best soldiers, the corps that had never failed. They were done." Suleiman didn't respond immediately. He stared at the map spread across the table. Vienna marked in red, surrounded by Ottoman positions. So close. But close didn't matter. Outside, the rain had returned, heavier than before. A cold, driving rain that turned the camp into a freezing swamp. Soldiers huddled under whatever cover they could find. Fires were nearly impossible to keep lit. Food was running low. Rations had been cut again that afternoon to 1 meal per day. And the sickness was getting worse. The Ottoman medical tents were overwhelmed. Dysentery, typhus, pneumonia setting in from the cold and wet. Men were dying faster from disease than from combat. By the morning of October 12, the number of soldiers who could still fight had dropped to around 85,000 men. Still overwhelming numbers. But numbers mean nothing if the soldiers can't or won't fight. October 12, morning. Suleiman called another war council. This time the tone was different. No debates about tactics. No discussions of strategy. Just one question. Do we stay or leave? The chief engineer spoke first. We have enough explosives for perhaps 3 more major bombs. But even if we knock down more of the wall, the defenders have proven they can hold the holes. We'd need to create so many holes at the same time that they can't defend them all. That would take weeks. We don't have weeks, Ibrahim said. He pointed toward the tent entrance where rain drummed against the fabric. It's October 12th. The roads are already impossible for heavy wagons. In 1 week, maybe 2, this rain will turn to snow. If we're still here when winter arrives, we won't make it back to Constantinople. An army trapped in enemy territory in winter doesn't retreat. It dies. One of the commanders, a veteran of the Persian campaigns, disagreed. If we leave now, it will be seen as defeat. The first time in Sultan Suleiman's rule that a city has successfully fought us off. Every enemy of the empire will take note. Then they'd do it again an hour later somewhere else. It was mind games as much as war. The message was clear. You're in our land now. You're in danger, and we're going to hurt you every mile back to Hungary. Ottoman officers tried to keep tight formations, but the column was stretched over miles, impossible to defend everywhere. Stragglers, men who fell behind because they were hurt or exhausted, were cut down. Supply groups ambushed, scouts killed. The Ottomans couldn't stop to fight back properly. Stopping meant losing more time in the weather, more deaths from sickness. They had to keep moving. October 25th, coming to Buda. By the time the army reached Buda, 10 days after leaving Vienna, it had lost another 5,000 men, not in battle, but from sickness, cold, exhaustion, and the constant hit-and-run attacks. The grand army that had left Constantinople in May, over 100,000 strong, was down to maybe 75,000. Able soldiers. 25,000 men lost, some dead, some badly hurt forever, some ran away, trying to find their way home on their own. The largest military campaign of Suleiman's rule had become the most expensive. At Buda, the army stopped. For 3 days, just long enough to reorganize, get new supplies from the Hungarian storage places, and care for the wounded. John Zapolia, the puppet king Suleiman had put in charge, greeted the Sultan with carefully practiced words of thanks. Your Majesty's campaign has protected Hungary. The Habsburgs have been embarrassed. Ferdinand will not dare challenge your power again. It was sort of true. Ferdinand's forces had done nothing during the siege. Vienna had held on its own, without help, without rescue. But everyone knew what Zapolia's speech really was. Face-saving lies. Suleiman accepted it without speaking. He stayed in Buda's palace for 2 nights, the first time he'd slept in an actual bed since leaving Constantinople. Then he gave the order to continue the march home. November, December, the Balkans. The retreat through the Balkans was slower, but less deadly than the escape from Vienna. The roads were better, the weather a little milder. Supply storage places had been set up on the march west, and they were still working. But the army was broken in spirit. Soldiers marched in silence. No songs, no bragging, just the trudge of exhausted men who wanted to be anywhere but here. The Janissaries, once the pride of the Ottoman military, were the most clearly shaken. They had failed. For the first time in their history, they'd been ordered to take a city and couldn't do it. Some blamed the weather. Some blamed the commanders. Some blamed Suleiman himself for starting the campaign too late in the year. quietly in whispers. They said things that would have gotten them killed if spoken out loud. This was a mistake. We should never have gone to Vienna. The Sultan's pride cost us everything. Officers reported the complaining to Ibrahim Pasha. He told them to ignore it. What were they going to do? Kill half the Janissary corps for low spirits? The complaining would stop once they got home. Once they were warm and fed and had time to forget. At least, that was the hope. December 8, 1529. Constantinople. Suleiman returned to his capital. The city came out to greet him. Crowds lining the streets, banners waving, musicians playing. It was a victory celebration. Planned, staged, necessary, because empires don't admit failure. The official story repeated in mosques, in public squares, in letters sent to foreign courts was simple. The campaign was a success. John Zapolia has been put back as King of Hungary. Ottoman power has been established over the region. Ferdinand Habsburg's claims have been crushed. There was no mention of Vienna. Well, there was mention, but only quickly. The Sultan's army came near Vienna, and the city shook with fear. Ferdinand ran away. The Habsburgs were embarrassed. Sort of true. Ferdinand had run away. The Habsburgs were embarrassed that Vienna had to defend itself. But the part about the city falling left out on purpose. Ottoman record-keepers writing official histories under royal support would describe the 1529 campaign as one of Suleiman's great wins. Some later historians did the same. After all, the Ottomans did control most of Hungary after 1529. Zapolia did rule as an Ottoman puppet. The big-picture situation in the region favored Constantinople, but everyone who'd been there knew the truth. Vienna had held. The most powerful man on earth had thrown everything at a single city, and failed to take it. And that failure mattered more than any amount of lies could erase. In the months after the campaign, Suleiman said almost nothing about Vienna in public. Privately, he met with Ibrahim Pasha to discuss what went wrong. The late start, the mud, the left-behind siege guns, the weather, the defenses, the defenders' skill. A dozen reasons, any one of which might have been beaten alone, but together. Impossible to overcome. We'll return, Suleiman said. Not this year, not next year, but we'll return. Ibrahim nodded. And next time we start in spring, we bring the heavy guns. We give ourselves 4 months, not 4 weeks. Suleiman agreed. But he never did return to Vienna. Other wars needed his attention. Persia, the Mediterranean, Hungary itself, which stayed fought over for decades. Vienna became the one target he never achieved. The city that got away. Back in Vienna, the winter of 1529 to 1530 was terrible. The city's supplies were nearly gone. Thousands of regular people had lost their homes in the suburb fires. The walls were still partly collapsed. But they'd survived. And in surviving, they'd proven something no one had quite believed before. The Ottomans could be stopped. Not by overwhelming force, not by help from God. By walls and mud and 16,000 soldiers who refused to quit. While Suleiman's record-keepers were writing about victory, Vienna was counting bodies. Winter 1529-1530. The city should have celebrated. Instead, it barely survived. The siege had ended in mid-October, but the damage was terrible. Entire sections of wall were rubble. The suburbs burned to keep. The Ottomans from hiding were gone. Thousands of refugees packed into a city with almost no food stored up. Winter came early that year. By November, people were starving. The harvest had been ruined. Fields stomped on by armies, crops burned, farmers dead or forced to leave. Supply wagons from the Austrian countryside were slow to arrive. Because the roads were still damaged. Rationing continued. Not military rationing, survival rationing. Families. Eating once a day. Bread mixed with sawdust to make it last longer. People who'd survived Ottoman attacks died of hunger and cold that winter. The official death count from the siege was around 4,000 soldiers killed in combat. But when you count regular people who died from starvation, sickness, and cold in the months after, the number climbs to somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000, nearly a quarter of Vienna's population. Then they'd do it again an hour later somewhere else. It was mind games as much as war. The message was clear. You're in our land now. You're in danger, and we're going to hurt you every mile back to Hungary. Ottoman officers tried to keep tight formations, but the column was stretched over miles, impossible to defend everywhere. Stragglers, men who fell behind because they were hurt or exhausted, were cut down. Supply groups ambushed, scouts killed. The Ottomans couldn't stop to fight back properly. Stopping meant losing more time in the weather, more deaths from sickness. They had to keep moving. October 25th, coming to Buda. By the time the army reached Buda, 10 days after leaving Vienna, it had lost another 5,000 men, not in battle, but from sickness, cold, exhaustion, and the constant hit-and-run attacks. The Grand Army that had left Constantinople in May, over 100,000 strong, was down to maybe 75,000 able soldiers. 25,000 men lost, some dead, some badly hurt forever, some ran away, trying to find their way home on their own. The largest military campaign of Suleiman's rule had become the most expensive. At Buda, the army stopped for 3 days, just long enough to reorganize, get new supplies from the Hungarian storage places, and care for the wounded. John Zapolya, the puppet king Suleiman had put in charge, greeted the Sultan with carefully practiced words of thanks. Your Majesty's campaign has protected Hungary. The Habsburgs have been embarrassed. Ferdinand will not dare challenge your power again. It was sort of true. Ferdinand's forces had done nothing during the siege. Vienna had held on its own, without help, without rescue. But everyone knew what Zapolya's speech really was. Face-saving lies. Suleiman accepted it without speaking. He stayed in Buda's palace for 2 nights, the first time he'd slept in an actual bed since leaving Constantinople. Then he gave the order to continue the march home. November, December, the Balkans. The retreat through the Balkans was slower, but less deadly than the escape from Vienna. The roads were better, the weather a little milder. Supply storage places had been set up on the march west, and they were still working. But the army was broken in spirit. Soldiers marched in silence. No songs, no bragging, just the trudge of exhausted men who wanted to be anywhere but here. The Janissaries, once the pride of the Ottoman military, were the most clearly shaken. They had failed. For the first time in their history, they'd been ordered to take a city and couldn't do it. Some blamed the weather. Some blamed the commanders. Some blamed Suleiman himself for starting the campaign too late in the year. Quietly in whispers, they said things that would have gotten them killed if spoken out loud. This was a mistake. We should never have gone to Vienna. The Sultan's pride cost us everything. Officers reported the complaining to Ibrahim Pasha. He told them to ignore it. What were they going to do? Kill half the Janissary corps for low spirits? The complaining would stop once they got home. Once they were warm and fed and had time to forget. At least that was the hope. December 8, 1529. Constantinople. Suleiman returned to his capital. The city came out to greet him. Crowds lining the streets, banners waving, musicians playing. It was a victory celebration. Planned, staged, necessary, because empires don't admit failure. The official story repeated in mosques, in public squares, in letters sent to foreign courts was simple. The campaign was a success. John Zapolya has been put back as King of Hungary. Ottoman power has been established over the region. Ferdinand Habsburg's claims have been crushed. There was no mention of Vienna. Well, there was mention but only quickly. The Sultan's army came near Vienna, and the city shook with fear. Ferdinand ran away. The Habsburgs were embarrassed. Sort of true. Ferdinand had run away. The Habsburgs were embarrassed that Vienna had to defend itself. But the part about the city falling left out on purpose. Ottoman record-keepers writing official histories under royal support would describe the 1529 campaign as one of Suleiman's great wins. Some later historians did the same. After all, the Ottomans did control most of Hungary after 1529. Zapolia did rule as an Ottoman puppet. The big-picture situation in the region favored Constantinople, but everyone who'd been there knew the truth. Vienna had held. The most powerful man on earth had thrown everything at a single city and failed to take it. And that failure mattered more than any amount of lies could erase. In the months after the campaign, Suleiman said almost nothing about Vienna in public. Privately, he met with Ibrahim Pasha to discuss what went wrong. The late start, the mud, the left-behind siege guns, the weather, the defenses, the defender's skill. A dozen reasons, any one of which might have been beaten alone, but together impossible to overcome. "We'll return," Suleiman said. "Not this year, not next year, but we'll return." Ibrahim nodded. "And next time we start in spring, we bring the heavy guns. We give ourselves 4 months, not 4 weeks. Suleiman agreed. But he never did return to Vienna. Other wars needed his attention. Persia, the Mediterranean, Hungary itself, which stayed fought over for decades. Vienna became the one target he never achieved. The city that got away. Back in Vienna, the winter of 1529 to 1530 was terrible. The city's supplies were nearly gone. Thousands of regular people had lost their homes in the suburb fires. The walls were still partly collapsed. But they'd survived. And in surviving, they'd proven something no one had quite believed before. The Ottomans could be stopped. Not by overwhelming force, not by help from God, by walls and mud and 16,000 soldiers who refused to quit. While Suleiman's record-keepers were writing about victory, Vienna was counting bodies. Winter 1529-1530. The city should have celebrated. Instead, it barely survived. The siege had ended in mid-October, but the damage was terrible. Entire sections of wall were rubble. The suburbs burned to keep the Ottomans from hiding were gone. Thousands of refugees packed into a city with almost no food stored up. Winter came early that year. By November, people were starving. The harvest had been ruined. Fields stomped on by armies, crops burned, farmers dead or forced to leave. Supply wagons from the Austrian countryside were slow to arrive because the roads were still damaged. Rationing continued. Not military rationing, survival rationing. Families eating once a day. Bread mixed with sawdust to make it last longer. People who'd survived Ottoman attacks died of hunger and cold that winter. The official death count from the siege was around 4,000 soldiers killed in combat. But when you count regular people who died from starvation, sickness, and cold in the months after, the number climbs to somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000, nearly a quarter of Vienna's population. Gone. But the city rebuilt. Ferdinand, who'd spent the siege hiding in Bohemia, returned in November and immediately began building up defenses. Not because he was brave, because he understood what Vienna's survival meant politically. If the city that had stopped Suleiman fell apart from neglect over the winter, it would erase the entire victory. So, Ferdinand poured money into rebuilding. Engineers were brought in from Italy, experts in the new trace Italian style of defense building, angled corner forts designed to survive big guns, lower, thicker walls that took cannonballs instead of breaking apart. Vienna would never again be an old-time fortress trying to survive in the age of gunpowder. It would become a modern fortress, one that could hold against any future Ottoman attack. The work took years, but it started that winter with workers hauling stone through the snow to rebuild what Suleiman's explosives had destroyed. May 4, 1530. Niklas von Salm died. The wound he'd taken during the October 11 attack, a chunk of stone from an explosion, had never healed right. Infection spread slowly, painfully. For 6 months, he'd commanded the rebuilding efforts while his body broke down. Officers begged him to rest. He refused. "I'll rest when the walls are rebuilt," he said. He never saw them finished. On the morning of May 4th, fever took over him. By evening, he was dead. He was 70 years old. The funeral was held at St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, the same cathedral that had stood within range of Ottoman cannons 5 months earlier. Thousands came, soldiers, regular people, nobles, even some of the refugees who'd lost everything. Ferdinand of Austria gave the speech at the funeral. He called Salm the savior of Christianity. It wasn't empty talk. If Vienna had fallen, Ferdinand would have lost his capital and likely his throne. The Habsburgs would have been embarrassed. Ottoman influence would have reached to the Rhine. Salm's defense had stopped that. One old man, 16,000 soldiers, 2 weeks of hell, and Europe's map stayed the same. Salm was buried with full honors. His tomb was eventually moved to the votive church, a church built in the 1800s to remember Vienna's survival. His grave marker was simple. He held 3 words. But they said everything. The big picture results. Right away, the siege changed nothing. Hungary stayed split between Ferdinand's western lands and Zapolia's Ottoman-backed eastern kingdom. The border was a constantly shifting war zone. Small fights, raids, fortresses changing hands. It would stay that way for 150 years. But in the bigger picture, Vienna mattered a lot. For the Ottomans, 1529 marked the limit of growth into Central Europe. Suleiman would launch other campaigns into Hungary. 1532, 1541, 1543, 1566. Some were successful. The Ottomans captured more fortresses, secured more land, but he never seriously threatened Vienna again. Not because he didn't want to, because the 1529 campaign had taught a hard lesson. Supply lines matter more than armies. You can have 100,000 soldiers, but if the roads are mud and the supplies don't arrive and winter is coming, none of it matters. Vienna was simply too far from Constantinople to keep up a long siege with 1,500 supply systems. The Ottomans could raid into Austria. They could hold Hungary, but they couldn't push deeper into the Holy Roman Empire without stretching too far and falling apart. 1529 was the high point. Ottoman power would stay strong for another 100 years, but it would never again come as close to the heart of Christian Europe. For the Habsburgs, Vienna's survival was proof. Ferdinand had been seen as weak, a prince who relied on his brother's power, who couldn't hold Hungary, who'd run from his own capital when the enemy came. But his city had held, and that mattered. Within a year, Ferdinand worked out a truce with Suleiman, not a treaty. The Sultan refused to officially recognize Ferdinand as King of Hungary, but a practical ceasefire that accepted things as they were. Hungary would stay divided. Both sides would keep what they held, and neither would launch major attacks for a few years. It wasn't peace, but it was stability, and it gave the Habsburgs time to build the military and political systems needed to resist Ottoman pressure for the next century. For Europe, Vienna proved something that had seemed uncertain after Mohacs. The Ottomans weren't unbeatable. Yes, they were powerful. Yes, they controlled huge territories. Yes, they'd crushed Hungary and Rhodes and Belgrade, but they could be stopped. Not by miracles, not by massive armies that didn't exist, by smart commanders, well-prepared defenses, and soldiers willing to fight. It was a lesson that would shape European military thinking for generations. Defenses became obsessions. Every major city invested in modern protections. Trace Italian corner forts spread across the continent. Because if Vienna, an old-time fortress with crumbling walls, could hold against Suleiman, then a properly designed fortress should be nearly impossible to capture. The age of siege warfare had begun for real. The human cost. Numbers don't capture what the siege meant to the people who lived through it. For the soldiers, those who survived, it was the biggest moment of their lives. Veterans of the Vienna Guard were legends. They'd stood on the walls when the Janissaries came. They'd held broken sections that should have fallen. They'd done the impossible. Some received land and titles from Ferdinand. Others went back to regular life and spent the rest of their days telling the story to anyone who'd listen. For the regular people, especially the women who'd fought on the walls, there was no official recognition. No medals, no money, no monuments, just the knowledge that they'd survived. And for many of them, that was enough. For the Ottomans, who'd survived the retreat, the siege was a wound that never quite healed. They had been part of the largest army Suleiman ever gathered. They'd marched with confidence, expecting an easy victory, and they'd been broken by a city that shouldn't have been able to resist. Some blamed the weather, some blamed the commanders, some quietly blamed the Sultan. But all of them carried the memory of those weeks in the cold and mud outside Vienna, watching the walls hold while their friends died. It changed the Ottoman military mentally. The Janissaries were no longer unbeatable in their own minds. Officers were more careful. Campaigns were planned with more attention to supply lines and less assumption of certain victory. 1529 didn't destroy Ottoman power, but it introduced doubt, and doubt eats away at confidence. What the siege really proved, Vienna wasn't won by having more men. The defenders were outnumbered 7-1. It wasn't won by better equipment. The Ottomans had more guns, more explosives, more of everything. It wasn't won by help from God or miracle weather. Despite what some record keepers claimed, it was won by preparation, skill, and refusal to break. Salm and his engineers had done everything right. Burned the suburbs, made the walls stronger, built backup defenses, organized operations to stop enemy tunnels. The soldiers had done their jobs, held the broken sections, fixed the walls every night, fought until they couldn't stand, and then kept fighting. The regular people had helped, carrying supplies, throwing stones, doing whatever needed to be done. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't glorious. It was just effective. And in the end, that was enough. 16,000 people stopped the most powerful empire on earth. Not because they were heroes, because they refused to be victims. October 11th, 1529 became a date remembered across Europe. The day Vienna held. The day the Ottoman advance stopped. The day a 70-year-old count and a mixed-together guard did what entire kingdoms had failed to do. They survived. And in surviving, they changed history. But here's what most people forget. This was only the first time the Ottomans came for Vienna. They would return, and when they did, the stakes would be even higher. Take a moment and think about what you just heard. 16,000 soldiers, a 70-year-old commander, 2 weeks of constant attacks by the most powerful army in the world. And they held, not because of miracles, not because of luck, because they understood that survival meant doing the impossible one day at a time. If this story has grabbed you, if you felt the weight of those October days, leave a comment. Tell me, what would you have done on those walls? Could you have held that broken section? And if you want more stories like this, stories that pull you into the past and make you feel what was at stake, subscribe. Because what you just heard, it's only half the story. Let me show you what I mean. Because here's the thing about Vienna in 1529, it was only the first time the Ottomans came. Suleiman retreated. The walls were rebuilt. Europe breathed a sigh of relief and thought the danger had passed. But empires don't forget embarrassment. 154 years later in 1683, the Ottomans returned. This time they brought an army so huge it made the 1529 siege look like a small fight. Over 200,000 soldiers, the largest Ottoman force ever gathered for a European campaign. They surrounded Vienna with a wall of men and weapons that stretched for miles. And this time, the siege wouldn't last 2 weeks. It would last 2 months. The defenders were outnumbered, outgunned, supplies running out, the walls crumbling under constant bombing. By September of 1683, Vienna was days from falling, maybe hours. And then, from the hills overlooking the city, something appeared that would change the course of history. The largest horseman charge ever recorded. 18,000 riders led by the legendary winged hussars. Warriors whose armor was decorated with massive eagle wings that roared like thunder when they rode. They came down on the Ottoman army like the anger of God. What happened next decided the fate of Europe for the next 300 years. The Second Siege of Vienna 1683 is coming soon to this channel. The desperation, the heroism, the largest battle of the 1600s. You won't want to miss it. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, because when we tell that story, it's going to be unlike anything you've ever seen. Vienna stood once in 1529. But could it stand again? This is Dark History Class, where the past comes alive and every story matters. If this moved you, like this video. Share it with someone who loves history and drop a comment. I read every single one. There are so many more stories waiting to be told. Stories of courage, betrayal, giving up everything, and survival. Subscribe and let's keep bringing the past to life together. See you in the next one.